In 1922, when archaeologist Howard Carter cracked open the sealed chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb deep beneath the Egyptian desert, he expected gold, he expected artifacts, he expected the dusty silence of a civilization frozen in time. What he did not expect, what no one expected, was food. Specifically, he found sealed clay pots filled with honey that was over 3,000 years old. And when the researchers analyzed it, they reached a conclusion that defied every modern assumption about food. It was still edible, not preserved in some scientific laboratory, not treated with modern chemicals. Just honey, sitting in a tomb for 3 millennia, quietly waiting. That discovery changes everything about the way we think about food and time. Walk into any modern grocery store today and you will be surrounded by expiration dates. Best by, use by, sell by, they are printed on nearly every single item on the shelf. A loaf of bread expires in 5 days. Milk lasts 2 weeks if you are lucky. Potato chips, crackers, even bottled water, everything carries the quiet warning that time is running out. We have been trained, generation after generation, to believe that food is fragile, that it decays, that the clock is always ticking. And for most of what fills those shelves, that is completely true. Commercially produced food is designed for turnover, not for longevity. It is engineered with moisture levels, additives, and processing methods that make it taste good in the short term but surrender quickly to bacteria, mold, and oxidation. The grocery store model is built on a cycle of buy, discard, and repurchase. Expiration dates are not just safety guidelines, they are a business model. But here is what the grocery store does not want you to think about. Some foods simply do not expire, not under the right conditions, not ever. These are the pantry kings, the ancient, humble, unglamorous ingredients that have sustained human civilizations for thousands of years without refrigeration, without preservatives, and without expiration dates. Their names are salt, sugar, and honey. And when stored properly, they will outlast you, your children, and your grandchildren. The idea of a deep pantry, a serious, intentional food storage system, has largely vanished from modern culture. But it was not always this way. A century ago, every family that survived harsh winters or unpredictable harvests did so because of what was packed away in the cellar. If you have ever stepped into an old Amish farmhouse or visited a traditional homestead, you may have caught a glimpse of what that world looked like. Rows of glass jars, ceramic crocks, wooden barrels, and sealed buckets lining cool stone walls. Shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with preserved goods that would see the family through months of isolation if necessary. The pantry was not a convenience, it was a lifeline. That wisdom did not die because it stopped working. It faded because the grocery store made it feel unnecessary. But supply chain disruptions, extreme weather events, and economic uncertainty have reminded a new generation of people that self-sufficiency is not paranoia, it is prudence. And it starts with understanding which 3 ingredients should anchor any serious food storage strategy. In this series, we are going to explore the real science behind why salt, sugar, and honey are essentially immortal. We will travel through history and chemistry, debunk the myths that cause people to throw away perfectly good food, and walk through the practical modern methods that make long-term storage accessible to anyone. You do not need a farm or a root cellar or a massive budget. You need information, a few simple supplies, and an understanding of why these 3 ingredients have served humanity since before recorded history began. Let us start with the science. Let us start with the truth. And let us start where all great preservation stories begin, in the dark, quiet depths of an ancient tomb, where a jar of honey waited 3,000 years for someone to finally ask, "How is this still good?" Salt is not food in the traditional sense. It does not come from a plant. It was never alive. It does not grow. It does not breathe. It does not decay. Salt is sodium chloride nacl, a mineral compound formed through geological processes over millions of years. When you shake salt onto your dinner plate, you are using a substance as old as the earth itself. That fundamental fact is the beginning of understanding why salt never expires. Every organic food, fruits, vegetables, grains, meat, dairy, is composed of carbon-based molecules that are vulnerable to biological processes. Bacteria consume them. Mold colonizes them. Enzymes within the food continue to react even after harvest, breaking down proteins, fats, and sugars over time. This is what decay is. Biological and chemical processes converting complex organic structures into simpler compounds. All of it requires the presence of living organisms or reactive chemistry. Salt has none of that. Its ionic crystal lattice structure is extraordinarily stable. There is nothing in sodium chloride for bacteria to eat. There is no organic material to break down. In a dry environment, a block of salt mine today is chemically identical to a block of salt mine 10,000 years ago. The Romans understood this better than almost any civilization in history. The word salary derives from the Latin salarium, rooted in sal salt, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given allowances specifically to purchase. Salt was that valuable. It was the primary method of preserving meat and fish across the entire ancient world, allowing soldiers to march without starving, ships to sail for months without resupply, and civilizations to survive years of agricultural failure. Salt-cured meats found in archaeological sites in northern Europe date back over 8,000 years. The ancient Chinese were mining and trading salt as early as 6000 BC. Salt roads, literal trade routes dedicated to salt transport, crossed continents for millennia. Wars were fought over salt deposits. Cities were built near salt sources. For most of human history, access to salt was access to survival. The science of how salt preserves other foods is known as osmosis. When salt is applied to meat or submerged with vegetables in a brine solution, it draws water out of the cells of whatever it is treating. Simultaneously, it draws water out of any bacteria present. This process, called plasmolysis, essentially dehydrates bacteria to the point of death or inactivity. With less available water and a disrupted cellular environment, microbial growth becomes impossible. Salt does not kill bacteria by being toxic in the conventional sense. It kills them by stealing the one thing every living organism requires: water. As for salt itself, its only true enemy is moisture. When salt absorbs humidity from the air, it clumps together and eventually forms a solid mass, a process called caking. Table salt, with clumped and hardened into what looks like a rock, is still chemically perfect. It has not spoiled, it has not lost any of its mineral content or preservation properties. The solution is straightforward: break it apart mechanically, spread it out to dry in a low heat of a no more than 250 F, and it returns to its loose, pourable form. Adding a few grains of dry rice to a salt container is an old but effective method for absorbing ambient moisture and preventing clumping in the first place. For long-term storage purposes, plain non-iodized salt is often recommended over iodized table salt. Iodine is a trace additive that, while beneficial nutritionally, can subtly affect the flavor of cured foods over time and may interact with certain preservation processes. Non-iodized sea salt or Himalayan pink salt stored in sealed containers in a cool, dark, dry location will remain fully functional indefinitely. There is no scientific basis for assigning an expiration date to properly stored, pure salt. The best-by date that appears on commercial salt packaging is a regulatory formality, a concession to labeling laws, not a reflection of any actual degradation. For emergency preparedness and deep pantry building, salt deserves to be stored in bulk quantities, not because you will use it all in a year or even in a decade, but because if a situation arises where you are preserving meat, fermenting vegetables, or making food safer for extended periods without refrigeration, salt is irreplaceable. No other single ingredient plays as many roles in food preservation. It cures, it ferments, it brines, it flavors. It has served as the cornerstone of human food storage for 80 centuries, and it will continue to do so long after the modern grocery store model is a historical footnote. The honey found in Egyptian tombs was not preserved through luck. It was preserved through chemistry, and that chemistry is so elegant, so perfectly constructed, that it has remained intact across 3 millennia without any human intervention. Honey is one of the most remarkable substances in the natural world. And understanding why it never spoils requires looking at 3 distinct mechanisms that work together to create an environment where bacteria simply cannot survive. The first mechanism is water content. Bacteria, like all living organisms, require water to function and reproduce. Most bacteria need a water activity level of at least 0.91 to grow, meaning roughly 91% of the water in a substance needs to be free and available to them. Honey typically contains less than 18% water by weight, and much of that water is chemically bound to the sugars present, making it unavailable to microorganisms. This condition is called low water activity, and it is devastating to bacteria. They arrive in honey, find almost no accessible water, and essentially dehydrate and die. This is not a metaphor, it is a documented biological mechanism. Honey is so effective at this that it has been used medicinally for centuries to treat wounds, precisely because bacteria cannot colonize it. The second mechanism is sugar concentration. Honey is composed of approximately 80% sugars, primarily fructose and glucose, and this extremely high sugar concentration compounds the low water problem for bacteria through a process called osmotic pressure, when bacteria encounter high concentrations of dissolved sugars. Water is pulled out of the bacterial cells and into the surrounding liquid through osmosis, just as salt does to bacteria in a brine. The bacteria lose their internal water and collapse. They cannot maintain the cellular pressure required to function, reproduce, or cause spoilage. Honey essentially drowns bacteria in sugar while simultaneously dehydrating them, a dual mechanism that makes it extraordinarily hostile to microbial life. The third mechanism is natural acidity. Honey has a pH that typically falls between 3.2 and 4.5, making it moderately acidic. This acidity comes from organic acids, primarily gluconic acid, produced during the process by which bees convert nectar into honey. Most bacteria and pathogens prefer a near-neutral pH environment around 6.5 to 7.5. Honey's acidic environment disrupts bacterial enzyme function and cellular processes, adding a third layer of antimicrobial protection on top of the low water activity and high osmotic pressure. And if that were not enough, many varieties of honey, particularly raw, unprocessed honey, also contain trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide, released slowly through enzymatic activity, which provides an additional antimicrobial effect. Raw honey also contains propolis compounds, bee-derived antifungal and antibacterial substances that contribute to its protective profile. Raw honey is preferable to commercially processed honey for long-term storage because the pasteurization and ultrafiltration processes used in commercial production remove many of the trace enzymes, pollen, and antimicrobial compounds that contribute to honey's resilience. Properly stored raw honey in a sealed container at cool room temperature has no theoretical expiration date. The oldest edible honey ever documented was found in those Georgian archaeological sites and those Egyptian tombs, and the operative word is edible. It was tested, and it was safe. Of the three pantry kings, sugar is perhaps the most misunderstood from a storage perspective. Salt is obviously a mineral that lasts forever. Honey has the dramatic scientific backstory and the Egyptian tomb credentials. Sugar, by contrast, seems almost mundane, a white powder in a paper bag from the grocery store, but granulated. White sugar, sucrose, is, in the right conditions, just as immortal as its famous companions, and understanding its chemistry explains both its extraordinary shelf life and the specific mistakes that can ruin a long-term sugar supply. Sucrose is a disaccharide, a molecule composed of 1 unit of glucose and 1 unit of fructose bonded together. It is produced by plants, primarily sugarcane and sugar beets, through photosynthesis. In its dry, refined, granulated form, white sugar is chemically stable in a way that closely resembles salt. There is nothing for microorganisms to work with. Bacteria and mold require moisture to colonize a food source. Granulated sugar contains, essentially, zero moisture. It is also not nutritionally accessible to pathogens in the same way a piece of fruit or meat is. Its crystalline structure does not provide the enzymatic or cellular environment that supports microbial growth. A sealed bag of granulated white sugar stored properly will not degrade chemically over any human timescale. Brown sugar and powdered sugar are slightly different cases. Brown sugar contains molasses, a hygroscopic substance that readily absorbs moisture from the air, which means it is more vulnerable to clumping and microbial contamination if exposed to humidity over extended periods. Powdered sugar contains cornstarch as an anti-caking agent, which can absorb moisture and potentially degrade over very long storage windows. For serious long-term storage, plain granulated white sugar is the most stable option. The primary enemy of a sugar stockpile is the same as salt's enemy, moisture. But sugar also has a second significant threat that salt does not: insects and pests. Ants and grain beetles are strongly attracted to sugar. And a paper bag or even a standard plastic container offers inadequate protection over multi-year storage. For serious long-term preservation, the modern homesteader and preparedness community has largely converged on a method that has proven remarkably reliable: the Mylar bag and food-grade bucket system. Here is how it works. A food-grade bucket, typically 5 gallons, made from a DP plastic free of BPA and other harmful compounds, serves as the outer structural and pest-resistant container. Inside the bucket, a Mylar bag made from biaxially oriented polyester film serves as the actual food barrier. Mylar is largely impermeable to oxygen and moisture, providing protection that neither the bucket alone nor the original grocery packaging can match. The sugar is poured into the Mylar bag, the bag is heat-sealed using an iron or a specialized bag sealer. And then the bucket lid is pressed firmly shut. Stored in a cool, dark, dry location, sugar packed this way carries an effective shelf life measured in decades. One critical warning for sugar storage that is counterintuitive but well documented in the preparedness community: do not use oxygen absorbers with granulated sugar. Oxygen absorbers are small packets containing iron powder that react with oxygen to create a near-vacuum environment inside sealed containers. They work extremely well for foods like white rice, dried beans, and wheat berries. But sugar is hygroscopic enough that the moisture generated by the iron oxidation process in oxygen absorbers will cause the sugar to clump into a solid, rock-hard mass, essentially an unusable brick. Opening a bucket of sugar that has been sealed with an oxygen absorber to find a single fused block is a frustrating discovery that can be avoided entirely. For sugar, the Mylar seal alone is sufficient, no oxygen absorbers needed. The environment in which you store your deep pantry is as important as the containers you use. Temperature is the most critical variable. Every 10° Fahrenheit reduction in storage temperature roughly doubles the shelf life of most stored foods. A pantry maintained at 55 F stores food significantly longer than one at 75 F, which stores food longer than a garage that reaches 95 F in summer. The ideal storage location is cool below 70 F, ideally consistently dark. Light degrades both packaging and some nutrients over time, and dry below 15% relative humidity. A basement, root cellar, or interior closet away from exterior walls typically meets all three criteria in most climates. White rice, while not one of the three pantry kings, deserves a brief mention here because it shares many of sugar's storage properties and is a natural companion in any deep pantry. Polished white rice stored in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers in food-grade buckets carries a shelf life of 25 to 30 years under proper conditions. It is calorie-dense, familiar, easy to cook, and universally tolerated across diverse diets, the ideal base carbohydrate for any emergency food supply. There is a word the preparedness community uses that sometimes makes people uncomfortable: resilience. It sounds like the language of doomsday thinking, of bunkers and apocalypse scenarios and people who have written off civilization. But resilience, in its oldest and most practical sense, has nothing to do with fear. It has to do with the simple, honest recognition that the world is unpredictable and that caring for the people who depend on you means being ready for interruptions you cannot control. The modern grocery store represents one of the most sophisticated logistical achievements in human history. Thousands of products, sourced from dozens of countries, appearing reliably on shelves within 24 to 72 hours of being sold. It is extraordinary. It is also fragile. The food distribution system that stocks your local grocery store typically operates on a just-in-time inventory model, meaning warehouses hold only a few days' worth of supply at any given time. A significant weather event, a fuel shortage, a labor disruption, a regional transportation failure, any of these can strip shelves within 48 to 72 hours. We have seen it happen. Most people who lived through a significant winter storm, a major hurricane, or the early weeks of a supply chain disruption remember the moment they stood in front of an empty shelf looking for something basic: flour, rice, canned goods, salt. A deep pantry is not a hedge against the end of the world. It is a hedge against a bad month. It is the difference between a difficult situation and a desperate one. It is the knowledge that if your income stops unexpectedly, if roads close for a week, if the regional distribution center faces a shutdown, your family eats. That is the whole philosophy. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extreme. Just the quiet, steady accumulation of a buffer between your household and the uncertainty of the supply chain. The Amish communities of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana have maintained this philosophy without interruption for generations. They were not preserving food out of fear. They were preserving food because their grandparents did, and their grandparents' grandparents did, and they understood at a bone-deep practical level that a household that manages its own food supply is a household that is genuinely free. Free from dependence, free from panic buying. Free from the anxiety of watching grocery prices rise and wondering whether the budget will hold. The root cellar and the pantry shelf were not relics of poverty, they were symbols of sovereignty. That wisdom is not lost, it is returning, and the good news is that beginning is far simpler and far less expensive than most people assume. You do not need to buy a year's worth of food at once. You do not need a dedicated storage room or a specialized facility. You need to start, and you need to start small. The single most achievable entry point into long-term food storage costs approximately $20. A 5-pound bag of non-iodized salt, a 5-pound bag of granulated white sugar, and a small jar of raw honey. These 3 items, sealed in appropriate containers and stored properly, are your foundation. They will last indefinitely. They are functional as cooking staples today and as preservation tools in any emergency scenario. They cost almost nothing to acquire and nothing to maintain. From that foundation, build methodically and without pressure. Once a month, add 1 new bucket project, a single food-grade bucket filled with 1 commodity. White rice 1 month, dried beans the next, hard red wheat if you have a grain mill, rolled oats, pasta, apple cider vinegar, which shares honey's natural acidity and has its own extraordinary shelf life, is a useful addition for both cooking and medicinal purposes. Each bucket costs between $15 and $30 filled and sealed. Over the course of a year, with modest monthly additions, a household can build a supply that provides genuine food security for 3 to 6 months. There is something else that happens when you begin building a deep pantry that is harder to quantify but no less real than the practical benefits. You begin to feel a connection to your own family history, to the generations of people who understood that the land and the larder together were the only real guarantees. Most of us grew up with grandparents or great-grandparents who kept a cellar or a pantry, who canned their own tomatoes, who bought flour in 50-pound sacks, who knew without being taught that a household that stores food is a household that survives hard times with dignity. That is the legacy these 3 ingredients carry: salt that was traded by Roman soldiers, honey that outlasted a pharaoh, sugar sealed in a mylar bag in a basement in Ohio, waiting patiently for the moment it is needed. This is not about fear, it is about love for your family, for your future, and for the ancient. Practical wisdom that kept humanity fed long before the first grocery store opened its doors. Start this week, start small, the pantry kings are waiting.